In this video, we're going to look at one of the quietest, strangest, and most disturbing chapters in the history of the Appalachian Trail. It's a story that begins with a wooden, three-walled shelter in southwestern Virginia, a notebook that lived inside it for decades, and a man named Randall Lee Smith who returned to almost the same patch of ground 27 years apart and tried to do almost the same thing both times. The second time, in 2008, he very nearly succeeded again. Before we get to this man, though, we need to talk about the notebook, because this is the story where the notebook matters as much as anyone in it. The Appalachian Trail runs roughly 2,190 miles from Springer Mountain in Georgia to Mount Katahdin in Maine. Every year, an estimated 3 million people set foot on some part of it. A few thousand attempt to hike the whole thing end to end, the discipline known as a through hike, which generally takes between 5 and 7 months of continuous walking. Most fail. The ones who succeed earn a kind of folk celebrity in the small, gossipy world that lives on the trail. That world is held together by two things. The first is the trail itself, the white blazes painted onto trees and rocks every couple of 100 feet for the entire length. The second is the shelter system. Every 8 to 12 miles, give or take, there is a simple wooden three-walled lean-to, usually sleeping 6 to 10 people on a raised plank floor. Some are old enough to remember the trail's earliest hikers in the late 1930s. Others have been rebuilt half a dozen times. Each one has a roof, a fire ring, a privy in the trees, and a notebook. The notebook is the shelter log, and the shelter log is the trail. There is no central rule about what goes in a shelter log. There is no editor. Hikers stop in for the night, find the log resting on a shelf or under a rock or stuffed in a Ziploc bag, and they write whatever they want. Sometimes that's a name, a date, and where they came from that morning. Sometimes it's a weather report or a warning about a downed tree or a bear sighting. Sometimes it's a joke about somebody else's snoring. Long-distance hikers leave a kind of running mail trail in the logs, signing in with their trail names, the nicknames they go by during the hike, knowing the people walking behind them will read what they wrote a day or a week later. There are entries in the shelter logs that have become folklore, notes that everyone on the trail talks about for a season, riddles, drawings, confessions. But the shelter log isn't just a curiosity, it's also the trail's most important safety tool. If a hiker goes missing, the search begins with the logs. Investigators walk north to south or south to north, opening every notebook, looking for the missing person's handwriting, narrowing the last known location down to a window of 1 to 2 days. The shelter log is, in effect, the only continuous written record of who passed through where and when. It is the trail's memory. It is also entirely unsupervised. There is no one at the shelter when you sign the log. There is no proof that the person writing the entry is who they say they are. There is no proof that the entry is honest. The book sits in the shelter, waiting for whoever opens it next. It has held the handwriting of people who would later be saved by it, and people who would later be killed near it, and at least once, the handwriting of someone who was both. The shelter we are going to focus on is called Wapiti. It sits in the George Washington and Jefferson National Forest in Giles County, Virginia, near the small town of Pearisburg. It was built in 1980, and in the spring of 1981, 2 hikers from Maine signed the log there for the last time. Robert Mountford Jr. was 27 years old in the spring of 1981. He was a social worker from Maine, and he worked with children with developmental disabilities. His mother ran a small school for those same children, and Robert had grown up around them. He was, by every account, gentle, soft-spoken, and easy to be around. His hiking partner was Susan Ramsay, also 27, also from Maine, also a social worker. Most people called her Susu. The two had been friends for years. They were not romantically involved. They were close in the way people are close when they share a vocation, a worldview, and a sense of humor about the world's harder edges. That spring, they decided to hike a long section of the Appalachian Trail together, starting in the south and walking north. The hike had a purpose. They were raising money for the school Mountford's mother ran. The plan was straightforward. They would set out from Georgia in late April, walk through the spring, and turn the journey into stories and photographs and donations. The first 3 weeks went as expected. They walked through Georgia, into Tennessee, through the Smokies, and into Virginia. They were not the fastest hikers on the trail. They were not the slowest. They stopped in trail towns to resupply. They signed shelter logs. They were seen at the small grocery stores that double as hiker hubs. Their handwriting moved north up a chain of notebooks at a pace of about 8 miles a day. On the afternoon of May 19th, 1981, they reached Pearisburg, Virginia. According to people who later reconstructed their final hours, they stopped at a small grocery store in town. There, by chance, they crossed paths with a local man who was also at the store that day. His name was Randall Lee Smith. He was 28 years old. Smith had been raised in Pearisburg by his mother. They lived in a small, run-down 4-room house. His father had not been in the picture. In high school, Smith had no close friends and no girlfriend. He was a loner who fished and hunted and spent long hours in the woods around town. He told stories about himself that were not true. He claimed accomplishments that hadn't happened. The lies were transparent and constant, and they earned him a nickname that stuck for the rest of his life. People in Pearisburg called him LR, short for Lion Randall. What exactly was said at the grocery store that afternoon, no one knows. What is known is that later that day, Mountford and Ramsay hiked up to the Wapiti Shelter to spend the night, and later that evening, Randall Lee Smith arrived at the same shelter. Wapiti was less than a year old at the time. It was a typical AT shelter. 3 walls, raised plank floor, a fire ring in front. The 3 of them ate together. According to the partial reconstruction that prosecutors and investigators later pieced together, Mountford and Ramsay extended Smith the standard courtesy of the trail. They shared their food. They talked with him. They were social workers in a place far from home, meeting a quiet, awkward local man, and they did what people in their profession instinctively do. They tried to draw him out. Sometime that night, Smith attacked them. He shot Robert Mountford Jr. in the head with a .22 caliber pistol. He attacked Laura Susan Ramsay with a piece of iron, struck her in the head, and stabbed her 13 times with a knife and a long nail. The medical examiner later noted defensive wounds on her hands. When it was over, Smith carried the bodies away from the shelter. He placed each of them inside their own sleeping bags, buried them in shallow graves, several hundred yards apart, in the woods around Wapiti. He took some of their belongings, and he left. Then, as if nothing had happened, the shelter remained open. The next hikers to pass through Wapiti in the days that followed signed the log normally. The notebook recorded their names. None of them knew that 2 people were buried in the trees a few hundred yards away. It was the absence of an entry that finally raised the alarm. Mountford and Ramsay had supplies and money waiting for them in Pearisburg. They never arrived to collect them. Other hikers reaching the town began comparing notes. The last log entries from Mountford and Ramsay were narrowed down to Wapiti. On May 30th, 11 days after the murders, a search party reached the shelter. They almost walked past it. Wapiti looked undisturbed, the way every AT shelter looks. Then someone noticed the dry blood that soaked into the cracks between the floorboards. They began searching the woods around it. Under a mound of leaves in a small clearing, they found Susan Ramsay in her sleeping bag. The next day, they found Robert Mountford Jr. buried in his. Investigators returning to the shelter went through Ramsay's backpack. Inside, they found a book she had planned to read on the trip. On the cover of the book was a clear, bloody fingerprint. It did not belong to Robert Mountford Jr. It did not belong to Susan Ramsay. It belonged to Randall Lee Smith. By the time the print was matched, Smith had fled to Virginia. He was eventually arrested in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. He initially claimed amnesia and said he didn't know who he was or why he was there. After extradition back to Virginia, the amnesia story collapsed. He stopped talking about the case entirely. The case never went to trial. Prosecutors, holding strong physical evidence but no motive, were worried about how a jury would respond to the question of why. They offered Smith a plea deal. He took it. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder in 1982. He received 2 concurrent 15-year sentences. There was no detailed account in court of what happened at Wapiti that night. There was no testimony from Smith. The official record fell silent. For the next decade and a half, Smith was, by the prison system's own description, a model inmate. He was quiet. He did his time. He racked up no significant disciplinary issues. Every year that he became eligible for parole, every year the parole board kept Smith in prison. In September 1996, 15 years into his sentence, Smith reached his mandatory release date. The parole board could not keep him any longer. He left prison wearing an electronic monitoring bracelet on his ankle and a parole supervision period that would run for the next 10 years. He returned to Parisburg. He moved back into his mother's old house. The trail, for a long time, didn't see him again. For the next 12 years, Randall Lee Smith lived in near total seclusion in Parisburg. Neighbors saw him occasionally. Hikers passing through the area sometimes reported running into a quiet, older man on the Appalachian Trail who would talk briefly and then move on. Some of them, looking back, would wonder who had they been talking to. None of them, at the time, made the connection. By the spring of 2008, Smith was 55 years old. His mother was long dead. His utilities had been shut off for non-payment. He was, by every external measure, living on the absolute edge of subsistence. In early May of 2008, his neighbors realized they hadn't seen him in several days. They became concerned. They checked his house. There was nothing obviously wrong inside, but he wasn't there. His friends and neighbors assumed he had gone into the woods. He had always loved the woods. They organized a small search party and hung missing person posters around Parisburg and along the local stretch of the Appalachian Trail. The posters had Randall Lee Smith's photo on them. On the evening of May 6, 2008, two men named Sean Farmer and Scott Johnson were camping at a site called Walnut Flats near Dismal Creek in the same forest as Wapiti Shelter. Farmer was 33 years old. Johnston was 38. They had driven in from Bluefield to fish and camp for a few days. The campsite they had chosen was about 1.5 miles from where Mountford and Ramsay had been buried in 1981. They did not know that. As the evening wore on, a man walked into their campsite. He was older, slight, slightly stooped. He had a thin, hungry-looking dog with him. He introduced himself as Ricky Williams. Farmer and Johnston extended the standard courtesy of the trail. They invited him to dinner. They had caught trout that day. They cleaned and cooked it over the fire and shared it with him, along with a pot of beans. They cooked an extra trout for the dog. While they ate, the man who called himself Ricky Williams talked. He told them he had attended Virginia Tech. He told them he had written papers for NASA. The stories did not entirely line up, but they were friendly and the man seemed harmless. As the night wore on and full darkness came, Farmer and Johnston started to wonder, mildly, how their visitor planned to get out of the woods. There were no roads close by. He had not arrived with a vehicle. The man stood up. He thanked them for the dinner. He said, "Guys, I gotta get out of here." He called his dog. He picked up his gear as if he was leaving. Then, as casually as someone reaching for a piece of firewood, he walked behind Sean Farmer, drew a pistol, and opened fire. He shot Farmer in the head and the chest. He turned and shot Scott Johnson in the neck and the back. Both men were somehow still alive. They fought back. The man who had called himself Ricky Williams ran. He climbed into Johnston's pickup truck and drove off into the dark. He didn't make it far. The truck crashed within a few miles of the campsite. Smith was found inside, badly injured, and taken into custody. The two wounded men managed to get themselves out of the woods. They reached help. They survived. Days later, recovering in the hospital, they were shown the missing person poster that had been hanging in Parisburg and along the trail for the previous week. They identified the man on the poster as the same man who had eaten their trout and shot them in the back. The man on the poster was Randall Lee Smith. He had been hiding in the woods around Wapiti the entire time he was officially missing. 4 days after the crash, on May 10th, 2008, Smith died in jail of the injuries he had sustained in the wreck. He never gave a statement about what he was doing in the woods. He never explained why he had returned to within 1.5 miles of the place he had killed Robert Mountford Jr. and Laura Susan Ramsay 27 years earlier. He never explained why, after meeting Sean Farmer and Scott Johnston in almost exactly the same circumstances under which he met his first victims, over a shared meal at a campsite, after being extended the trail's standard courtesy, he had tried to do almost the same thing. He took whatever he knew with him. There was no shelter log entry that has ever been made public that proves Randall Lee Smith signed his name at Wapiti on the night of May 19, 1981. There is no entry that proves he signed it as Ricky Williams in May 2008. He was not the kind of man who left a written record of himself when he could avoid it. He went into the woods to disappear, and he largely succeeded. But the people he killed and the people he tried to kill did sign. Robert Mountford Jr. and Laura Susan Ramsay's handwriting moved up the chain of shelter logs for 3 weeks before it stopped at Wapiti. The hikers that walked past their unmarked graves in the days that followed left entries too, never knowing what was a few hundred yards away. And after the bodies were found, after the trial, after Smith went to prison and came back out and disappeared into Pearisburg, more entries kept being added at Wapiti. Throughout every year of his sentence, through every year of his quiet, broke, monitored second life, the notebook kept filling. That is what the shelter log is. That is what the trail is. It is a record that survives the people inside it. It is a witness without a voice. There are roughly 250 shelters along the Appalachian Trail today. There are notebooks in nearly all of them. They have been signed by millions of people over almost a century. Some of those names belong to people who walked off the trail and finished their lives elsewhere. Some belong to people who never walked off at all. A small number of names, the ones the trail can never quite forget, appear in those logs twice. One as someone who was alive, and once as someone who the trail was about to lose. The Appalachian Trail does not haunt, it records, and the logbook eventually knew his name. Thanks for watching.